So hello and welcome to everyone joining us, whether you're live in the Zoom room or if you're catching up via our YouTube channel. I'm delighted to introduce our June Tuesday Spotlight, which will be closing our Visualising Egypt theme this year, which has been looking at the diversity and complexity of Egyptian art throughout Egyptian history. And today I'm very excited for our lecture topic. Our title today will be Deir el Medina Community and the Elite Theban Necropolis during the 18th Dynasty, a reassessment. So I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Dimitri Laboury, who is the Research Director of the F.R.S or FNRS, the National Foundation for Scientific Research of Belgium at the University of Liège, where he teaches as a professor of Egyptian art, history, and archaeology. So thank you very much, Dimitri, for being here. I know we're all very excited to hear your comments of the links between Deir el Medina and the Theban Necropolis. So I will pass over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Charlotte, for this very nice introduction. And I would like to say that it's really a pleasure and honor for me to be invited to share my research on the identity of the painters of the Theban elite necropolis of the 18th dynasty. And so today I would like to ask a question. Who made the private tomb of Thebes? Do we have a plain standard theory? Because of the contiguity of the two sites, it has often seemed natural to assume that Deir el Medina and the Theban elite necropolis were closely connected on a functional level. The inhabitants of the former, usually presented as the only identifiable group of tomb makers in Western Thebes during the New Kingdom, as John Romer put it, being easily considered as plausible candidates for the creation and decoration of the latter's tombs and funerary monuments. Oops. The problem with the presentation. Okay. Almost 3 decades ago, John Romer aimed at addressing the issue from a statistical point of view, and his attempt to evaluate and correlate the production rate in the Valley of the Kings, that is the work carried out by Deir el Medina community, and in the nearby elite cemetery on the eastern slope of the same Theban rock formation, led him to the more nuanced following suggestion. I quote here, statistical comparison of activity in the two necropolis, private and royal, shows that the activities of the celebrated tomb makers of Deir el Medina were linked to the activities of the craftsmen who made the private tombs. That this overall equivalence of effort was maintained within the royal and private necropolis of Thebes for more than 400 years strongly suggests that Theban tomb making was conducted by a permanent workforce and directed by a single authority. The same authority, therefore, that Deir el Medina archives describe as overseeing the work of the royal tomb. Thus, the offices of the administration that control the unknown craftsmen who made and decorated the private tombs are probably to be discovered in the same departments that control work in the royal necropolis, end of quote. Without discussing the rather problematic question of the estimation or quantification of tomb production rate, and consequently of the conclusiveness of the supposed correlation, this so-called equivalence of effort, to quote John Romer, does not offer any proof that, first, the private workforce was a permanent entity situated on the West Bank, and second, that it was directed by the same authority that oversaw the Deir el Medina workmen. Furthermore, many other historical factors, of course, could have influenced and thus account for this apparent similar production rate in both cemeteries. But more importantly, there is a methodological and documentary problem which we are now much more aware of than in the time when John Romer contributed to the topic. That is the evolution of Deir el Medina and its community through the half of a millennium of its existence. It is indeed increasingly better acknowledged and considered that Egyptology long used to extrapolate the life of this crew over 5 centuries, mainly thanks to the exceptional richness of textual sources from the very last 100 years or so of its history. And in this perspective, recent research on literacy practices, especially the study on the one hand of literature production and consumption in the village, here an article of Bernard Mathieu on the topic, and on the other hand, the use of pseudoscript, the so-called funny signs, studied by Ben Haring, have clearly demonstrated a dramatic evolution in the socio-educational level of the population housed in this settlement during the New Kingdom. Besides, Andreas Dorn convincingly suggested that the site might not have been in use on a permanent basis in its early history. All this renders even more challenging the question of who made the tombs of Thebes, or the private tombs of Thebes, especially during the 18th dynasty, and what the involvement of the El Medina crew could have been in this process. In order to address this double issue, let us start with a reassessment of the foundation of the commonly assumed hypothesis of the El Medina as the most plausible origin for the artists and craftsmen responsible for the making and decoration of Theban private tombs, with a special focus on the 18th dynasty. So, go to my second point, the evidence for the involvement of the El Medina crew in the making of private tombs. As is well known, the members of the El Medina community often use their own talents, skills, and resources to create their funerary equipment, including tombs for themselves, as well as for their colleagues within the village. A good example of this is TT 359. It's a good example of these informal workshop practices. It's a tomb in the name of the 20th dynasty superior of the crew in Herchawi, who commissioned two of the best painters of his team, the two brothers Nebnefer and Horimin, to decorate his funerary monument. Of course, such a case of internal employment, that is when an artist works for a colleague, a superior, or for himself, cannot be considered as evidence for the participation of the El Medina workforces in the production of private tombs, in the sense of elite private tombs, such as the ones in the Theban cemetery from Gornet Moai to Drabu Naga. And the same holds true for other artist funerary chapels, such as the 18th dynasty mutualized tombs of Jehuti Mose and Kenamun in Saqqara, studied by Alain Pierre Zivi, whose connection with the El Medina community is still unclear, or the one of Nebamun and Ipuki at El Khoja, or back to the village, the one of Nu and Nachmin in the El Medina. As a matter of fact, the only elite private tombs that might be related to the activity of the El Medina artists and craftsmen are all of Ramesside times, with two dubious cases in the 19th century dynasty and two much clearer cases for the late 20th dynasty. Let's start with the 19th dynasty with TT 32. In the sloping passage leading to the burial chamber of TT 32, made for the overseer of the granaries of Amun Jehuti Mose during the reign of Ramses II, three control marks signed by the painter Zeshked Pai from Titzolt and Fabian to suggest that this painter most probably supervised the tunneling operation and maybe also, but it's a hypothesis, the entire architecture of the tomb, and could be moreover identified with a contemporary namesake attested as a member of the El Medina community. But Pai was a rather common name at that time, and other painters named Pai are attested in the early Ramesside period, including outside the El Medina, weakening what must remain a mere hypothesis. So we have to forget about this case. The next case is in the Saqqara, in the Boubasteyan cemetery, Tomb Boubasteyan 116. It's the contemporaneous royal steward and ambassador of Ramses II, Nechero I Mose, whose nickname was Parechnoua, spelled Parichnawa in Hittite sources. He had his tomb made in the so-called cliffs of the Boubasteyan in Saqqara, with a protruding high-relief depiction of Hathor that you can see on the right side of the screen as a cow coming out of the rock of the rear wall and protecting a royal figure in adoration. Alain Pierre Zivi, who studied this tomb and discovered it, compared this rock-cut statue with an almost equivalent two-dimensional representation of the goddess preceded by the effigy of a prince labeled with the epithets Baruch Nawa, on a stela in the name of the call listener in the place of Maat, the Sejem Ash and Set Maat, Terbechnet, which is kept in the British Museum. And since this tomb of this Deir el Medina crew member features a similar depiction of Hathor as a cow emerging from the cliff, as well as the one of his colleague, the sculptor Ken, in TT4, Zivi inferred that those two artists of Deir el Medina were responsible for the decoration of the tomb of Necheru Imos. Of course, it's an appealing but yet insufficiently conclusive speculation. Definitely, we have more indisputable cases for the late 20th dynasty. They both relate to the same individual, the chief painter of Deir el Medina, Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nakhte, a high educated artist who was plainly a real star of his time, and happened to decorate at least two Theban elite tombs, TT 65 and TT 113, as can be demonstrated on signature as well as on stylistic evidence. Let's start with TT 113. This tomb, in the name of the web priest and Heri Secheta of the estate of Amun-Kinebu, now is badly damaged, but it was visited in the early 19th century, notably by John J. Wilkinson, one of the founding father of British Egyptology, who recorded a funeral scene with a self-portrait in assistenza of our painter. So he depicted himself in his own composition. So he depicted himself reading the ritual of the opening of the mouth and designated himself as the scribe and deputy of the venerable institution of the tomb, that is Deir el Medina, Amenhotep. The few preserved remains of the decoration, compare favorably with the quite well-characterized styles of Amenhotep, which was studied by Candy Keller and Thomas Bach. The other case, TT 65, it's a Thutmose tomb of the time of Hatshepsut, which was usurped by the chief of the altar chamber and the chief of the temple archives of Amun, Imiseba, in the late 20th dynasty. This tomb is referred to in a graffito left in year 9, in KV 9 of Ramses IX, stating that the scribe Amenhotep and his son, the scribe and deputy of painters Amun-Nacht of the tomb, came there after they executed the decoration in the tomb of the overseer of the scribes of the temple, Imiseba, in the estate of Amun. As Candy Keller and Thomas Bach later on have perfectly shown, the stylistic analysis of the decoration of TT65 not only allows the specific painterly handwriting to recognize the specific painterly handwriting, or I should say hand painting of the two father and son artists, but it also leads to the conclusion that they were helped in their task by a friend and contemporary of Amenhotep, Harry Min, whom we've met earlier in the tomb of Henerkawi, whose individual style has also been treated by Keller in detail. Those two isolated cases of the late 20th dynasty are nevertheless very specific in the sense that they belong to a rather special period of ancient Egyptian history, a period, I quote Thomas Bach here, of extreme civic violence, inter-elite skirmishing, various bloody wars, and patronage from the Ramses Nax family and the Hilk, and locally all-powerful Amun clergy. And a period during which the Theban artistic talents were clearly to be found on the West Bank, that is in Deir el Medina, and apparently not anymore in the estate of Karnak. Second point to pinpoint in this respect is that they are also highly specific because they involve a close and limited social network, since both Kinebu and Imiseba are documented to have business contact with the Deir el Medina community. So it's a very, very small world here in this case. And in any case, those two private works of the distinguished Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nacht, in the Theban elite necropolis cannot substantiate a general theory of a regular implication of Deir el Medina crew in the making of such tombs, a theory for which the evidence is actually very scarce, to say the least. So how can we get out of this one-way street? If the chief painter Amenhotep, son of Amun-Nacht, was plainly the kind of artist Renaissance would have designated as a pictor doctus, that is, a scholar painter, accumulating prestigious responsibilities and religious titles and capable of creating new compositions, both in images and text, for his royal as well as private clientele, such was certainly not the case for most, if not all, of his pre-Ramesside colleagues in the village of Deir el Medina. As mentioned earlier, the dearth of textual production in and around the settlement during the 18th dynasty and the use of parascriptural system of notation, the pseudo-script of the so-called Phoenicians studied by Ben Haring and his team, strongly hint in this direction, but there are more and non-exclusively philological arguments to support such a deduction. The tombs of the artists at issue, or in other words, their own work for themselves. First of all, among the 18th dynasty tombs that can be related to the coeval community of Deir el Medina, a strikingly small amount of them were decorated, in clear contrast with the Ramesside situation of the village and its necropolis. Out of a total of about 300 burials datable to the 18th dynasty in both Western and Eastern cemeteries of Deir el Medina, only 6 or 7 of them, so less than 3% of the tombs were discovered with a decorated chapel. In addition to this raw archaeological fact that might be due at least partly to socio-economic factors, or more revealingly, almost all of those funerary monuments were decorated in a quite rudimentary way, which needs to be further analyzed in this talk. Let's start with TT 340, which is probably the oldest one. So the earliest preserved of those 6 tombs, the unfinished TT 340, was made for the co-listener, it's my translation of Sejem Ash, Amenemhat, apparently thanks to his son, Senefer, who depicted himself in the tomb as someone who writes correctly and calls that is his father's name, to live. The funerary chapel is of tiny dimensions. Its only room measures 1.59 meter long and 2.20 meters large and only 1.64 meter high. So it's very tiny. I cannot stand in this tomb, stand up, I mean. So that it's not possible to stand in it, as emphasized by Nadine Cherpion, who published this monument for the IFAO. Even more significantly, the iconographic scheme and repertoire are particularly basic, strongly reminiscent of the usual decoration of funerary stelae of the time. With the adoration and presentation of offerings to Osiris and Anubis in a symmetric composition, or the deceased couple sitting in front of an offering table with family members aligned in rows. The side walls, with their upper part rounded by the vaulted ceiling of the chamber, also display the typical stela motif of the pair of wedged eyes on both sides of an incense spot on top of 3 water lines for the sign Mu in ancient Egyptian. And the inscriptions on the wall confirm the impression of the decoration directly inspired, if not derived, from the visual culture of basic or low-cost funerary monument such as stele. Indeed, through a careful analysis of those short texts, the late Jean-Marie Cruchten was able to demonstrate that Senefer, the alleged and self-proclaimed son who writes correctly, clumsily reproduced formula learned by rote, such as Hetep-Dinizut, which he tried to adapt or amend almost exclusively with uniliteral signs, thus making many errors that betrays his actual and rather low level of literacy. And the same holds true for the shape of the signs. Even in his boastful signature as a self-portrait in assistenza, our obviously self-taught novice scribe Senefer made a lot of orthographic mistakes. Besides, he regularly broke the composition or editorial rules for hieroglyphic panels in monumental decoration, inverting the orientation of a text and the figure to which it is related, as you can see here, disregarding the norms of grouping hieroglyphs in balanced quadrats, like here for Hetep-Dinizut, rejecting final signs out of a panel that was not properly composed in advance, as you can see with the last signs on both sides of this panel, or even reversing the order of words or signs for the epithet Hekajet of Osiris, for instance. Interestingly enough, Daniel Soliman, in his study of the use of workmen's marks in pre-Amarna tombs of Deir el Medina, observed exactly the same kind of hieroglyphic mistakes on the few inscribed objects from those burials. You have the quote here on the screen, and you see that they could spell sometimes with uniliteral or monoconsonantal sign some words, which is highly unusual in hieroglyphic writing system, of course. Comparable evidence of a lack of hieroglyphic mastery might also sometimes be detected in the official, though certainly supervised, work of the Deir el Medina crew during the 18th dynasty, that is on the murals of the contemporaneous tombs in the Valley of the Kings. For instance, in the burial chamber of Amenhotep II, KV 35, the first one of in the history of New Kingdom royal tombs whose decoration in the schematic style of an illustrated ritual papyrus, the so-called Book of Amduat, is complemented by large-scale figurative scenes depicting the king in interaction with deities, as you can see on the screen. In one of those scenes, here you have one example, the epithet of Anubis Tep Juhef was written in 2 columns so that the determinatives or classifier and suffix pronoun at the end of the word Jew were pushed into the second column, a word break certainly not to be expected from a properly trained scribe who fully comprehends what he writes. This kind of mistake seems to reveal again a rather limited capacity to improvise on the basis of a given textual pattern, probably not entirely understood. To the contrary, such errors are extremely rare in coeval elite Theban tombs, where an improvisational ability to lay out and adapt the compositions according to the surface to be decorated can usually be observed. A very good and clear example was provided by the archaeological investigation of TT 79 of Menkeper Aseneb by Heike Gutsch. The clearance of the courtyard of this tomb of the overseer of the double granaries of Upper and Lower Egypt, Menkeper Aseneb, brought to light an ostracon, which you have on the left-hand side of the screen, with a sketched inscription in cursive hieroglyphs prepared for a scene that was luckily preserved in the funerary chapel itself that you have on the right-hand side of the screen. Heike Heyer, formerly Heike Gutsch, the editor of the monument, compared the 2 versions of this short text. That is the initial draft on the one hand, and its final actualization on the wall of the tomb on the other hand. And she noted only minor deviations, I quote her. But these deviations provide clear evidence of an excellent mastery of monumental hieroglyphic writing system. The inscription has indeed been re-edited with respect to the space left for it in the depicted scene, that is the size and distribution of the column without any break inside a single word. And you can see, I reported the break between the lines with a red line on the ostracon, on the drawing of the ostracon on the left-hand side of the screen. To adjust the text accordingly, the painter had to reconfigure the inscription, modifying the hieroglyphic orthography or spelling of some words. As you can see, whenever I incrusted a small detail in polychromy, it means that the orthography of the word was changed from the draft to the final version or actualization on the wall. And so he changed different kinds of M, for example. He reorganized signs in a single quadrat, or he rewrote the word Iaout with only an ideogram to adapt to the surface to be decorated on the wall. These emendations, obviously made on the spot during the transcription of the sketched model onto the wall, demonstrate that the author of this mural was a scholar painter, an expert in the arts and rules of designing ancient Egyptian monumental decoration. Conversely, in TT 340, if Senefer appears as a professional painter who knows how to prepare pigment, how to handle a brush, and so on, he clearly tried to go beyond the limitation of his artistic and hieroglyphic training and skills. The quite unorthodox style of his figures, with their wasted limbs, and rather stiff shape, is also evidence that he ventured out of his usual comfort zone in order to produce this exceptional decorated funerary chapel for his plainly beloved father, Amenemhat. The next tomb is in the same vein. it's 354. The analysis of this second 18th dynasty decorated tomb in Deir el Medina leads to very similar conclusion as you're going to see. The chapel is barely larger. It's very tiny again, and its decoration, left even more unfinished than in TT 340, presents exactly the same characteristic. So you have a stela-like composition and a repertoire, also derived from stela kind of decoration, with antithetic depictions of funerary deities and seated couple of deceased receiving offerings. The tomb could not be attributed to a specific individual because its inscriptions are completely absent, though the places to receive the text were in some cases manifestly prepared, but left blank, with a little panel in front of the gods, for example. As if the literate painter to inscribe those texts had never been able to come. As Nadine Cherpion noted, the style is clumsy, careless, and obviously maladroit at every level. The elongated figure with heavy limbs, or the lack of any details for the necklaces from the necklaces to the baskets or the offerings. Everything points to an insufficiently mastered craftsmanship, end of quote. The best example of this is perhaps to be observed in the decoration of the ceiling, whereas the son of Amenemhat in TT 340 opted for the quite simple depiction of a vine rack with alternatively a grape and a vine leaf in a grid-like framework. The anonymous painter of TT 354 tried to imitate the more sophisticated fabric patterns usually encountered on the ceiling of elite tombs, but produce an awkwardly irregular and unbalanced composition that reveals and betrays his ignorance of the technique to paint such a motif. The presence of most probably pedagogic sketches that clarifies the structure of such patterns on the walls of unfinished elite tombs or even on ostraca shows that these elaborate designs were not so common nor easy to make, but required a training or at least an explanation to which the painter of TT 354 obviously did not have access. So just like Senefer in TT 340, in his wish to create an exceptionally decorated funerary chapel within the 18th dynasty cemetery of Deir el Medina, this painter ventured beyond the limit of his actual artistic abilities or skills, and this is still plainly detectable in his work. The next 18th dynasty decorated tomb chapel that we have to examine this afternoon of Deir el Medina is certainly of the same date, but it was made for a superior in the hierarchy of the crew, the chief or Heri, and director of all the works in the great place, Kha, who's famous because of the discovery of his undisturbed burial by Ernesto Schiaparelli's expedition in 1906, now exhibited in the Turin Museo Egizio. The painted chapel has in fact dimensions very similar to the previous one. It's quite small, but it's inverted, so with a single room, longer than large, and a slightly higher ceiling, reaching a highest level of 2 meters, 15, sorry. Its entrance door and general architecture were more monumentalized, and the decoration definitely closer to contemporary elite standards. First of all, the classic themes of the deceased, first of all, the classic themes of the deceased couple adoring funerary deities and receiving offerings were enhanced by subsidiary scenes of quite nicely diverse offering bearers and female musicians. So you can see here the ceiling, and here are the musicians. And those thematics, those topics, those motifs were clearly derived from the repertoire of nobles' tombs. The rear and focal wall still presents in its stela-like rounded upper part a symmetric composition with 2 images of Anubis as a jackal recumbent on a base representing the Sech motif on both sides of a central papyrus and lotus flower bouquet. but it was designed to be integrated physically as well as iconographically with a rear stela, probably a stela now kept in the Turin Museum, a formula to be adopted in subsequent chapels and of the cemetery, and again inspired from elite tombs. The style is also much more reminiscent of elite tombs, with better shaped and balanced figures, though often still quite elongated and not entirely devoid of any trace of clumsiness. Transparency and texture effects in the depiction of garments and wigs, as you can see now on the screen. Finally, detailed offerings and pieces of jewelry, and much better mastered painted fabric patterns on the ceiling, as we've just seen earlier. But the inscriptions on those murals are nevertheless still flawed with many oddities. In addition to a few hieroglyphs presenting an unusual form, such as a surprisingly fat viper, as you can see on the right upper corner of the screen, or the hero or after the name of Ra, which is missing, there are a lot of gaps. Like here for senative, meritive, you have signs that are missing. And Jeanne Vendier d'Abadier already noted in the publication of the tomb those inversions, this lack of mastery in hieroglyphic inscriptions. Furthermore, some signs were sometimes simply omitted, like the N and the F, as I just said, in the expression senative, for the designation of Ra's wife, Merit, adding to the inaccuracy of those short texts. Since Ra was at the highest level in the hierarchy of Deir el Medina crew, it's extremely likely that just as in Herchawi did for his own tomb TT 359 that we've seen at the beginning of my talk, a little bit more than 2 centuries later, it seems that Ra, just like in Herchawi, employed the best talents of his team to decorate his funerary monument. But those supposedly top artists within the community of Deir el Medina, rather well trained in the art of painting, showed clear signs of a limited hieroglyphic literacy, probably comparable to Ra himself, who apparently did not ask for any correction, though he seems to have claimed to be a royal scribe. The title actually only attested on 2 of his decorated sticks from his tomb. So again, the gap with elite tombs makers is patent. And it's not until the end of the 18th dynasty, after the Atenist episode of the reign of Akhenaten, that inscriptions start to appear flawless in the tomb of Deir el Medina. This is the case of the nearby TT 338, published by Maria Tossi, the tomb of Maya. The funerary chapel of another prominent member of the community, the painter of Amun in the place of Maya, named Maya, who might also have been chief of the artists of the place of Maat, according to Mario Tossi. This small monument, now preserved in the Museo Egizio in Turin, is again of quite tiny dimensions, measuring 2.25 meters long by 1.45 meters large and only 1.85 meters high. It was beautifully painted in a very well-mastered, directly post-Amarna style, with a more diversified iconographic repertoire, including 2 detailed boat, maybe we can see it here, 2 detailed boat processions, the so-called Abydos pilgrimage, a funeral scene with a lively group of female mourners, or a double depiction of the tomb, and much more space devoted to longer inscriptions written by a practiced and regular hand, with the 2 quotes of the so-called pyramid text, the Verklärungsritualen, published, or glorification ritual text published by Jan Assmann. You can see here. And then the following tombs in the timeline, like TT 268, presents exactly the same characteristics. So it's a nowadays anonymous tomb. It's first chapel of TT 268. Only the lower part of the wall is still preserved, but the style of its decoration, as well as its iconography and even the paleography of its remaining text, are strongly reminiscent of the ones probably painted by Maya himself in TT 338, as you can see here. Finally, the unfinished mutualized tomb TT 291, shared by the two co-listeners Nu and Nachmin, is also to be dated to the very end of the 18th dynasty, just after the Amarna period, it seems. Although its styles and iconography are definitely more sober, not to say basic, its inscriptions are free from the kinds of mistakes encountered in pre-Amarna tombs of the village. So, art historical characterization of 18th dynasty decorated tombs in the cemetery of the Deir el Medina community, taking into account their size, their iconographic repertoire, their iconographic scheme, the style, the quality of workmanship, as well as their textual epigraphy, leads to some rather important conclusions for the question raised in the present lecture. First of all, compared to non-elite funerary monuments such as the Middle Kingdom chapel in Abydos, or the early New Kingdom structures built in the plain just below the slope of Drabunaga, they appear absolutely normal, quite average, and even with some tokens of ambition, certainly due to the specific skills of the members of the crew and their involvement in monumental production. These artists used and capitalized on an iconographic repertoire directly inspired by the visual culture of basic and/or low-cost or affordable funerary monuments such as stelae and their tradition, a visual culture they might have partly derived from their own professional activities, though it was probably shared by almost every ancient Egyptian. However, their production for themselves in this respect, at least during the pre-Amarna period, is quite far from the specific and more scholarly Deir el Medina iconographic tradition and culture the successor were to develop in the Ramesside period, that is, after the re-establishment of the community and its organizational reform under the reign of Horemheb, gradually appropriating and reinterpreting the visual and to some extent also the textual culture of the sophisticated royal tombs they built and decorated in the Valley of the Kings. Going back to the essential topic of this presentation, the comparison between these funerary monuments made by the Deir el Medina crew members of the pre-Amarna period with contemporary elite Theban tombs reveals a striking discrepancy in terms of artistic abilities and autonomy. The decoration of 18th dynasty chapels of Deir el Medina is extremely repetitive, and almost any attempt to step beyond the limits of the classic and basic repertoire was marked by quite patent or easily detectable mistakes. To the contrary, as we have seen in coeval elite tombs of the Theban Necropolis, the schemes are usually customized to the space to be decorated and, more importantly, to the idiosyncrasies of the professional, historical, and individual profile or trajectory of the commissioning patrons. Moreover, when they are preserved, sketches for wall decorations always convey a very minimalist information, often focused on the general layout or composition or the thematic encoding, implying first a rather large range of freedom for the artist to create, but also a great artistic autonomy in the sense of an ability to improvise on an elaborate on a raw, basic given model or theme. Precisely an ability that seems to be so much lacking in the artistic profile of the pre-Amarna members of the Deir el Medina community. So these observations thus compel us to conclude that the 18th dynasty artists of Deir el Medina were actually incapable of making the nearby elite Theban tombs. So once again, who made the private tombs of Thebes? Actually, we have to consider that there were many more artists around. Despite what has often been thought and repeated, the Deir el Medina community was certainly not the only identifiable group of tomb makers in Western Thebes during the New Kingdom. A crucial hint in this respect is provided by the double self-portrait in assistenza of the painter of Amun Huzerhat in TT 75, the tomb of his superior in the domain of Amun, the second high priest of Amun, Amenhotep Sisay, under the reign of Thutmose IV. Its contextualized analysis indeed reveals that it functioned as a pictorial signature. So this is self-depiction. It functioned as a pictorial signature left by the master painter who decorated this funerary chapel, proving that an artist officially affiliated to the domain of Amun in Karnak, and apparently one of the most prominent of his time, could engage in the making of elite monuments and even be allowed by his private patron to sign his work. This is corroborated by another famous case of equal importance, the one of Pahiri of El Kab. This future governor of his hometown, in Upper Egypt, was in an earlier stage of his career a painter of Amun as well. In this capacity, he appears to have decorated the very individualized and now almost completely lost Theban tomb of his colleague and in all likelihood friend, the scribe accountant of grain Wensu, whose fragments are now kept in the Louvre Museum in Paris. But also the rock-cut tomb of his renowned grandfather, the veteran Ahmose, son of Ibana, in El Kab, which you can see in the backside of the screen. Labeling the most prominent of his many self-depictions in this funerary monument, the one that you have on the screen, by the son of his daughter, who directed the works in this tomb, as the one who causes to live the name of the father of his mother, the painter of Amun Pahiri, justified. This other case of a private tomb signed by a painter of Amun is of great significance in the perspective developed here, because it provides further evidence of the versatility and wide range of expertise of those artists who reveal themselves plainly capable of mastering an iconographic repertoire well beyond the limits of temple imagery, including in another medium than painting, since this tomb, the tomb of Ahmose, son of Ipana, is decorated in relief. And it also demonstrates the mobility, El Kab being distant of about 80 kilometers from the Theban area. The geographic mobility of 18th dynasty artists of the domain of Amun is actually well substantiated. For instance, the small stela 4528 of the Manchester Museum, in the name of the sculptor of Amun Anhotep, made by his colleague, the web priest of Amun, the chief sculptor Nejem, was found in 1895 by William Flinders Petrie and Quibble on the site of the Thutmose temple of Set at Ombos in Nagada, some 35 kilometers north of Thebes, where the two artists were probably sent on an official mission. Another stela house in the Louvre belonged to the chief sculptor, Chaimejat of Amun, Amenemope, who was also appointed as chief sculptor in the mansion of Hai in Abydos, so more than 100 kilometers further north. And we have other evidence of that kind of things. I just show you the case of the chief painter of Amun, who was assigned to restore the monuments in the post-Amarna period after the Amarna hackings, or Dedia, or his colleague in sculpture, the sculptor Hatiai, whose stela is now kept in the Rijksmuseum van Oude Eden in Leiden, who was also in charge of the refashioning, the remaking of God statues all over Egypt. These artistic commissions were in fact part of a much broader and general system developed from the very beginning of pharaonic society, and consisting in raising teams of well-trained experts or workforces who could then be dispatched and used all over the country according to the ruler's project, from the Old Kingdom to the Demotic period, if I may call it like this, with the article I just showed on the screen. This highly centralized system, which characterizes pharaonic society as a whole, accounts for the fact that whenever an ancient Egyptian artist mentioned his professional affiliation, it was always to the king or his residence, especially in the Old Kingdom, or to a temple, particularly since the New Kingdom, since it was in those royal institutions that artistic forces were raised, trained, and employed. And the system was probably overall system for ancient Egyptian society, as is demonstrated by the famous papyri of the Wadi Jarf published by Pierre Tallet. It's exactly the same system to raise a team which are well trained in specific functions and then can be dispatched to the needs of the crown, I would say. For the elite and the deliberate use of art as a display of prestige, one of the most important consequences of this institutional monopolization of artistic resources by Pharaoh, the main producer, consumer, and patron of arts, was that skilled, expert, and autonomous artists were to be found in such royal institutions. In this context, and getting back to the elite Theban necropolis under the 18th dynasty, it seems quite clear that the principal source for artistic talents in Upper Egypt during this first part of the New Kingdom was the domain of Amun based in Karnak. If the estate of Amun was indeed the main origin of the artists who made the private tombs of Thebes in the 18th dynasty, this might allow us to explain some characteristic of this necropolis. One such aspect is the very significant presence of the personnel of the domain of Amun, its top dignitaries, high priests, great stewards, as expected, of course, but also some lower ranking officials with a surprising importance of categories such as the scribe accountant of grain of Amun, as Wolfgang Helck underlined 3 decades ago. A good example and well-known case was already mentioned with the tomb of Wensu, almost certainly designed and decorated by the painter of Amun Pahiri, with whom he seems to have worked and might have been a friend. A similar professional as well as personal connection could justify the very existence of the world-famous exquisite, though very small and unfinished tomb of the horologer priest of Amun, Nacht Titi 52, despite the fact that he belonged to a social professional category that left almost no other archaeological trace, and was apparently not naturally meant to gain access to monumental deaths. This Nacht managed to own one of the most beautiful and valued tombs in the Theban Necropolis, probably because he could rely on a painter who was a friend of his in the administration where he worked. The same holds true for the other well-known tomb of Nacht, TT 161, a gardener of Amun, Kari and Hetepnecher and Amun in the time of Amenhotep III. It seems that in the entire history of ancient Egyptian art, floral bouquets have never been depicted as luxuriant and exuberant as in the single room of this tomb of a floral offering bearer of Amun. The artist responsible for the magnificent mural of this tomb, plainly a scholar painter, involved himself in his creation so far as to invent 3 new hieroglyphic compositions to pictorially transcribe the main title of our gardener, the floral offering bearer of Amun, to whom he thus seems to have been rather closely connected. As you can see here, the composition, and there are 3 variations on this composition. I think it's time to conclude now and to get back to the village. If the members of the Deir el Medina community could, without any possible doubt and increasingly through time, be occasionally commissioned to work outside their usual institutional posting, that is in their case the Royal Necropolis of Thebes, the same was true for the colleagues with other administrative affiliations all over Pharaoh's kingdom. Because of this mobility of artists, craftsmen, and workers in general in ancient Egypt, one cannot deduce from the proximity, the geographical proximity of Deir el Medina settlement and the nearby elite Theban necropolis, that the latter was the product of the former, no matter how such an inference might seem tantalizing. Quite the contrary, as we have seen, until at least the very end of the 18th dynasty, the inhabitants of the village demonstrated through their own productions for themselves their manifest inability to master the various skills required for the making of an elite tomb of the time. The reason for this is simply that they were trained in another specialty for another goal. This leads us to the very function of such a settlement and crew. Various camps for workmen on a rail mission are known from ancient Egypt, such as the one found by Herbert Winlock and his team on the site of the Al-Bahari, for example, or the huts built by the Deir el Medina crew itself in the Valley of the Kings at the occasion of the excavation and decoration of specific royal tombs. But the settlement of Deir el Medina is of another kind, more durable and organized, and made for a long-lasting undertaking. In New Kingdom archaeology, there's only one equivalent to it, the Amarna workmen's village. They both have in common their situation near a royal cemetery, which was obviously their raison d'être. This is precisely why the community settled in Deir el Medina did not, at least originally, have the abilities and training to create private tombs. They were initially skilled and probably put together to produce royal tombs of the type practiced in the early 18th dynasty when the village was founded. And it was only because of their own social educational improvements, along with the evolution of the artistic resources available in the Theban area during the Ramesside period, that some of them happened to decorate elite funerary monuments. Otherwise, like in any cemetery in ancient Egypt, It seems such private monuments were produced thanks to the local artistic resources to be found in temples or royal estate, if any. But the specialization of the crew hosted on the site of Deir el Medina, even if they were more or less secluded for security reasons regarding their knowledge about royal burials, does not necessarily mean that this team of workmen was completely isolated from the administration of the rest of the artistic production of the Theban area, especially in the 18th dynasty. Indeed, a recent study of the few pieces of evidence relating to the administration, and this is one of them, you can see it's a very tiny piece of evidence relating to the administration of the Deir el Medina community and its activities during the Thutmose period, confirmed that they were supervised by the mayor of Thebes, Ineni, and maybe also by the high priest of Amun, Hapuseneb, as Catherine Gabler and Daniel Soliman were able to show, underlying that those two high officials were also director of all offices of the domain of Amun. One also has to recall here that the painter Maya, owner of TT 338 in the cemetery of Deir el Medina, presented himself as a painter of Amun in the place of Ma, just like many of his successors in the early Ramesside institution of the tomb. So in the end, the suggestion made by John Römer that the Theban elite tomb making and the work of the Deir el Medina crew in the Royal Necropolis were both supervised by the same authority could nevertheless be correct, at least for most of the history of this community, even if this single authority was almost certainly situated on the east rather than on the west bank of the Nile. Thank you very much for your attention.
I just wanted to thank Dimitri Laboury once again for joining us and presenting for the Egypt Exploration Society today. This has been a fascinating topic, and I think we've all learned a lot, especially about that 18th dynasty community and how we shouldn't make those assumptions about a settlement that lasted for so many years. And I just wanted to remind everyone, do check out our online course program if you wanted to learn more about Egyptian language or art. We have various courses throughout the year. And again, please do become a member. Your support as a member enables us to host these free lectures for everyone to enjoy. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Dimitri, for your time today. And we hope to see you at another ES event soon. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.